Hello, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 12B live lesson. Now, this is going to be a long one because it's on Gothic literature and there's a lot of information to go over. So I'm just going to dive in and get started like usual. So we're going to start here on slide 5. So they give you history, the roots of the Goths first. So they tell you about where the name came from. The name basically comes from a group of Germanic warriors who defeated the Roman Empire in the 5th century. Um, After their victory, two of the main groups settled in Western Europe, which was France, Italy, and Spain, and a little bit of Eastern Europe. But the important thing is that the two main branches of these groups were called the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. So these were Goth tribes, and a lot of them influenced art and architecture in these settlements that got picked up by people in the medieval era and used a lot in religious architecture and symbolism. So that's how Goth influence got into Europe. And that's pretty much where the word Gothic comes from. Even though the cultural group disappeared before the medieval period, a lot of their symbolism and stuff lasted through the medieval period and was used. So they tell you from the very beginning here that the term Gothic acquired negative connotations during the Enlightenment period in England. So the Enlightenment period was basically when people were really big on science and being able to find the reasoning behind everything. So this happened after the medieval period, where England broke away from religion and they wanted to know more about how things worked, how the science of things broke down. And that was the Enlightenment period. So because science and being able to explain things was popular, people didn't actually like Gothic influence when it first came in. And part of the reason why is because this kind of made people go back to looking at the Greek and Roman civilizations from the Gothic period. And people used to sensationalize them as like the peak of European culture. The same way that we do stories with like the Greek mythology now, and we borrow ideas from them in terms of like public fight rings, coliseums, and stuff like that. They idolize those things during the Enlightenment period too. And it got so bad that people would look down on their own country's stuff because it wasn't close to what the Greeks and Romans used to do. So they considered that barbaric and Gothic and tried to give it basically a bad name, but it got popular anyway. So here, they tell you about when they became popular. So during the Romantic period, everyone kind of picked up Gothic art and made it a part of their writing. They really liked the architecture, the spires, the gargoyles they used to be on the churches. The Gothic period is where that came from. And just the ruins of old churches and abbeys were just considered really romantic. And by romantic here, I mean not romantic as in love, but as we studied earlier with the Romantic period in terms of going back to nature, focus on the individual, stuff like that. So they view the ruins of those churches being reclaimed by nature as like lonely places where people could think. So that sort of dark, brooding stereotype, just sort of showing up in an empty place and doing your internal character development there developed during the Gothic phase. So they give you a list here of characteristics of Gothic art. So I'll read them out. Savageness. So that can be both in design, in creatures that are featured, that can be in how the nature is characterized. You can do, like lots of shadows, roots overgrowing things. The love of change. Love of nature, those two go hand in hand because nature changes things and changes naturally over time. Grotesqueness or disturbed imagination. So that has to do basically with just what you see in the different types of art in the architecture, and also in writing to a certain degree. Rigidity or obstinacy. So rigidity is basically having a set of rules that you abide by and not wanting to budge on them. And obstinacy is not wanting to do new things. So there was a love of change that came naturally, but not of anything that was being forced on people. And then there's generosity. So these were common to medieval abbeys and castles that were on the English countryside, which were basically the landscapes that people, got the Gothic visuals from. So if you look at those characteristics, you can sort of see a lot of the influence from the church there. Generosity, rigidity or obstinacy. If you're a monk or a nun, you have your own set of rules to follow in terms of being a good person or being a godly person. And you weren't willing to be swayed by that. And you weren't willing to indulge in certain things. The grotesqueness or disturbed imagination just comes from looking at the surroundings and seeing the difference between your beliefs and how things work out, the world around you and how it's operating in chaos in comparison to the church itself. And then the love of nature and change, because those are things that are brought by God. The savageness is something that I think is added just from people kind of looking back at Gothic stuff at that time. So let's see. In lonely, gloomy places, the fact that they were ruins and set in lonely, gloomy places, they're talking about the abbeys and castles, increased their attractiveness in the eyes of Gothic novelists. So, romantic interest in the medieval period. So they basically talk here about how Gothic writing was writers attempting at the time to return to the fantasy of England's medieval Catholic roots. So back in the medieval age, people used to write stories trying to teach morals or lessons, but there was also a lot of writing about miracles, about other people who were not great in society being influenced by the devil and things like that. So there was kind of a fantasy element of it, especially with this coming after the Enlightenment. So people knew a lot about science sort of giving us more answers as a society than some religious stuff. So people were breaking away from that to get back into like the realm of things that can't be explained. So writers also set their novels in countries that were Catholic. And since Britain wasn't really Catholic and they, broke away from the church, most of those countries were France, Spain, sometimes Portugal, places where Catholicism were still alive and well. They changed the names of their characters to things that reminded them of Shakespeare's plays, like Antonia or Ambrosio. And then their settings were a big part of the story. So the settings were ruined castles, abbeys, dungeons. And they basically just went back to things that reminded people of the medieval era. So here we've got some influential Gothic authors. And I'm not going to read through this whole thing because you're going to need to take notes on this. And a quick run through isn't going to do enough. But I will highlight important things about each of these authors. So for Horace Walpole, they talk about him meeting Conyers Middleton, who was an interesting man with weird ideas about religion and a very skeptical point of view. So he wasn't a believer in very many things, but he had lots of interesting things to say about the world and the church, and it influenced Walpole in the way that he wrote. It says he remained a critic of superstition and blind faith for the rest of his life. And they tell you when he published his biggest book, which was The Castle of Otranto. He published this in 1765, and he labeled it as from the original Italian of Onofirio Moralto. So this was a thing that a lot of authors did, and this will be covered in another slide, but it was kind of like the Blair Witch Project, the way that they did these books. They would say, oh, I didn't just write this myself. I translated this old spooky story from this other language that you can't go and verify. So the Gothic era was honestly the start of a lot of stuff that we see in horror films, and even just, like more serious suspense films and stuff like that today. So the story was basically about a family who lived under a curse and what happened to them. But the most important thing about this slide is that it tells you the castle of Otranto was the first novel to use Gothic, like many Gothic conventions together. So this book had the sinister medieval settings. There were lots of haunted places and gallant heroes. So yes, there are heroes in Gothic literature. And it helped to influence another writer, the person who's up next, Anne Radcliffe. So Anne Radcliffe married a journalist, and she was a pioneer of Gothic art. So she used desolate, so that means empty, or awe-inspiring landscapes, here we go right here, to develop the mood of the story. So she was really big on all of the details building up to people feeling a sense of dread or mystery. She was one of the few famous Gothic authors that actually gave explanations for the supernatural stuff that happened in her books. So her books felt a little more like Sherlock Holmes, like a mystery, instead of just straight up Gothic horror. So her most famous work was The Mysteries of Udolpho, and it was written in 1974. So this story was basically about a young orphan who was the target of her uncle's scheme. So her uncle was a villain, and he basically tormented her. Now, this is also a convention that's in a lot of Gothic novels. There's a heroine who has to be saved, and she ends up being kind of chased down and hunted or tortured by the villain before she's saved. So this book became so popular that it made the heroine having to suffer through the book before being saved a convention in novels from that point forward. So she started that and made it popular. And then William Beckford, the interesting thing about him was he was not just someone who worked and wrote in their spare time. He inherited his father's fortune at a very young age. So he was actually able to travel and see a lot of things. And he was able to write a lot of novels that were set in a foreign place with realistic details. So his Gothic novel was Gothic, and he wrote it in French. But basically, it's about Gothic and his wicked mother, who's Carathis. So he's like a prince who's like super evil. He treats everyone badly. And basically, you just get to see him try to do more and more things to get power. And he ends up coming in contact with basically like a diabolical, like a mysterious evil power at the end that ends up being the end of him because he wants so much power. Gothic took place in a foreign land in the East, and there was basically a lot of people writing about foreign locations at the time. And this is kind of where the trend of that started. The lesson goes into this a little later, a little bit later on some later slides. But basically writing about these stories happening in a foreign land was a way to get around implying that people do those sort of like sick, disgusting things in England where everyone was. So they didn't want to write England or Britain in a bad light. So instead they would say, oh no, this didn't happen here. It happened in this other country. This is a translation of a story that I found from insert country here. And a lot of the time, because not only not only were they writing about Catholic um, Catholic countries at the time because England had just pushed out the church, but on top of that, there was a lot of fear and uncertainty about Middle Eastern and East Asian countries. So a lot of these stories were set either in Catholic countries so that they could comment on what Catholic priests were doing now that they were out of England, or they were talking about the East because they figured that people wouldn't be able to check to see if that's how things went there. And the unfortunate part of that is once you read something that's really good, if you like it a lot and it's written by someone that you trust, you might think it's true. Okay. The next part talks about the supernatural and the sublime. So this is another big part. It pretty much, this is what the goals and conventions of the Gothic novel were supposed to be about. So the biggest thing is that the subject of a lot of Gothic writers was the supernatural. And this was mostly because of the anti-enlightenment and anti-science thing that was happening at the time. They just wanted to go against what people were saying was good or proper or right. And they wanted to also just be entertaining by going against what the thought process was for the average person at this period of time. The second was for readers to grasp the sublime. So the sublime was an aesthetic principle, something that you could appreciate by picturing in your head or actually being able to see something. So it's an aesthetic principle that doesn't have like a direct translation, but it's pretty much events or object that have the power to make you afraid or be in awe at the idea of what's being described. It's supposed to make you feel an intense emotion that you otherwise wouldn't be able to feel in your everyday life. So they felt that experiencing the sublime was dependent on you experiencing terror. And they don't mean terror like just being afraid. It translates more to suspense. So terror was described at some point. Let's see. Is it a quote? Yeah. So terror was said to be experienced when gazing into a deep valley on a mountain climb. It's supposed to be uplifting in a deep and unusual way. There are some authors that tried to define what terror was at the time, but we'll get to that in a couple of the later slides. Okay, so slide number 11 is about the influence of medieval architecture. So we just get a little more information about the buildings that helped influence what people were writing. So the idea was that in these big buildings, pretty much what happened historically is Gothic architecture flourished between the 10th and 13th century. So this was before the Black Death and the bubonic plague. So at this point, the church was super powerful. This was after basically King Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope as King of England. So the church and the crown, the royals, were tight like this. So the church had a lot of power, even though they were religious and exempt from a lot of things. They were able to summon military force to force people to do stuff. And they were able to take money from people, command money from people to build these large castles and churches, halls, abbeys, and things like this. And then afterwards, in the 1500s, King Henry VIII dissolved the Catholic monasteries. So the long story short is he got into a fight with the Catholic Church about policy because of something he wanted to do that the church didn't approve of. And because the church didn't approve of it, he basically tried to one up them and made it very clear that the crown would always be the leading power in England and basically forced out the Catholic Church. So he straight up shut a lot of those monasteries and abbeys down. He didn't want to put money into funding them, since he was basically telling the church, get out, you don't have that much influence here anymore. So a lot of those abbeys and monasteries, um, first of all, they were built in places that were far away so that the nuns and monks um, could have peace while they studied. It also prevented any of the fights or wars that happened between the towns or regions from affecting the church. The church was basically only considered involved whenever they were taking power to do something. But in pretty much any other time, they tried to stay neutral in a way so they could do their own thing. So there were a lot of these old rundown buildings that like nature is taking over because they were abandoned. And these castles, forts, and abbeys were pretty much what the Gothic writers were using for inspiration. So they felt like pretty much the rundown monasteries represented the light and dark nature of humans. And it was just easy to see it in there, not only because of how the buildings looked, but also because of what the churches represented for England at that time. So let's see. I think that that's pretty much it. The themes of, so it says here that the Gothic writers, these ancient buildings, which could still be seen all over the countryside, became the symbol of decline and ruin. And they connected the isolation and degradation of these landscapes with the corresponding states of human nature. So remember, this is combined with the romantic, it has some overlap with the romantic period of this time. So the view of nature and being in the head of just one individual person to see their thoughts on things was part of the Romantic era. So it sort of spilled over into people who wrote Gothic stuff. Okay, and other conventions, terror and horror. So this slide basically wants to give you the definitions of terror and horror so you can tell the difference. So the long story short is that there were two groups of Gothic writers. Originally, Gothic writing was supposed to use some of the tenets of Romanticism along with the Gothic conventions in their stories. But when people actually started writing and saw what people liked, another group of authors decided that there should be a distinction between horror and terror and how they're used in Gothic literature, and that there wasn't as much of an emphasis on the romance part. So they pretty much wanted to focus on terror and horror because these were psychological things that got a lot of response from people when they were reading. They felt like fear was the most important thing to portray during these stories. So they ended up focusing on that. There were some authors who were against this. They give you a note here that Anne Radcliffe argued that Gothic writing should inspire terror, not horror. And then they tell you the difference in her definition, at least. Terror is the uncertainty and anticipation you feel before drawing aside a curtain. Horror is what you feel on seeing the monster on the other side. So terror is basically suspense, is that feeling of dread. You don't know what's going to happen next. So you kind of don't want to know, but you kind of do want to know. But oh my God, what will happen when you find out? That's terror. Horror is when you actually see, oh crap, there's someone there. They're trying to kill me. There's like a devil here. There's just something awful. There's a monster. There's a ghost. It's when you actually lay eyes on the thing and her definition and react to it. She wrote a whole essay about this called The Supernatural in Poetry, where she basically said that she felt like Gothic writing should avoid horror because it was too straightforward, crude, and vulgar. So it was the idea of scaring people, get them hyped up for what's about to happen, but don't actually be too crass or too gory in how you portray things. That wasn't really considered proper at the time. But she's more conservative than some other writers. So a lot of Gothic writers were like, nah, screw that. We're going to write what we want anyway. And they put a lot of different stuff, demons, witches, ghosts, and all kinds of things in their work. So those are also considered parts of Gothic conventions too. It's important to remember while you're learning about this stuff that there were actual people who talked about these things and wrote these things. So in the same way that there are, like, for example, people who would pick up an adventure novel or a comic book now and say, oh, well, this is what I like about this story, but what I think was really boring or really predictable was when they did this, this, and this. Back in the day when people were developing writing, back here, even in the 1300s, the 1500s, people also did that too. If an author didn't like what someone else did in their writing, they would write something else and basically make the ending or the stuff in the story different to try to show people who were reading how it was better. Okay, so here's slide 14, extreme emotions, psychology, and repressed urges. So this just goes more into the psychology of what was in these stories. This slide is important because it lets you know what sort of psychology was in these stories, pretty much. So a lot of the time, Gothic stories revolved around showing emotional and situational extremes. So lots of hauntings, deaths, and things like that. Especially popular was watching villains who basically just sank deeper and deeper into becoming more and more evil. And they also enjoyed reading about heroines who had to suffer all of these awful things before they got saved. Basically, Gothic writing was kind of just kind of like it's similar to the horror genre, but not quite, or the scary movie genre, whatever you want to call it, suspense, thriller, that kind of thing. So they were always looking for new ways to shock their audience. And that's how Gothic writers ended up with so many different conventions. They'd write something that was popular, and then someone else would write the thing that was popular, but with a twist, and then it would become popular. So other people would try to mimic it until someone else came along and added another change. So for example, in terms of trying to shock their audience, a lot of Gothic writers would write about stuff they weren't supposed to write about. Remember when I was talking about when they set their story in foreign lands? They did this so that they could get away with writing about stuff like murder, greed, and lust and corruption. A lot of the corruption stories were specifically about members of the clergy or people who were in the church. And this was kind of also an extra backbite to Catholics who were no longer in the country or that were low in number in the country. At the time, because of the Enlightenment, nobody was really on the side of large religious groups. So these books were popular because they portrayed religious people in a bad light at the time. And England was just now getting over like how power hungry the Catholic Church was in their history at the time. The bad news about this, obviously, is that if you're writing about people who are bandits or doing deviant things to people, religious corruption, those things were considered un-English. So they thrust them on those foreign cultures. But say, for example, you're someone from Turkey, and you read a Gothic book that someone said in Turkey where all these terrible things are happening to people, is misrepresentation. And this is kind of where this got started, with just using foreign lands as an excuse to write about things that happen. We use those conventions to write about really good things now. Like we'll just set something in a faraway fantasy land so we can show the difference between whatever happens there and how things usually go in real life. But Gothic Gothic writing is pretty much where writing about actual real foreign lands for an excuse to be able to get away with whatever you wanted started. Okay, so moving on here, we have common literary devices. So the important thing that they want to get across here in this slide is that frame narratives were popular during this time. So they give you the definition of what a frame narrative is. So that's when the story is not just about someone that you've heard of, some random person. Up until now, stories were mostly made up about people who didn't exist, or they would at least pretend to be about people who didn't exist, or someone from history that they didn't know very much about, and things like that. Frame narratives is when the person telling the story is also the main character of the story, or at least the focus of the story and how it's happening. So for some of you will have heard of Game of Thrones. Now, in the Game of Thrones book, it's written similar to the TV show, where you change perspective every chapter. Some chapters are about one character doing whatever it is they're doing, and other chapters are about completely different people who are in completely different places in the country doing other things. Sometimes you'll have characters pass each other and overlap, and you'll get to see an interaction from both sides of what's happening, kind of like in the show, but in writing. So this was basically what they did in the Gothic period. The frame narrative is literally when the storyteller is the actual character in the story. And by making it like this, if you wanted to get other information to the person reading, you would have to swap characters. So you would have to put in a new narrator who is now the character in the story giving their version of what happened. And this was exciting for a number of reasons. So before now, there weren't really any stories where you had to take into account the personality of the person telling the story. Like even in poetry at the time, going back to romantic stuff, the writers would just make up a person and just have this person's perspective in the story. They would be writing about how someone else looks and feels. But in these Gothic stories, they used a lot of first person point of views and omniscient third person third person limited that focused on the characters that was speaking. So that means that you have to deal with the character's personality, what they are seeing and feeling, and whatever it is they miss. And it means that if the character has any prejudices or biases, and whatever their motivations are, you can't trust them as a reader. And that's what made them exciting. You could read an entire book with one character and find out that basically they had the wrong idea about something, or their goals were not as pure as it seemed, based on what ends up happening and what they end up doing. So because you can tell multiple stories or different versions of the same story in one novel, they use that to their advantage. That's a lot of information to take in. And sometimes a character can interrupt the narrator while they're thinking or considering something. And the reason why they're able to do that is because if the narrator is a person in the story, they also have to interact with other people in the story. They don't just get to sit off to the side and report things. They actually have to interact with everyone. So you got the story as it was happening from the person that it was happening to. So even though these changes were jarring or difficult to sort of like grasp at first for people, it would make the reader pause and actually think about what was happening and draw conclusions instead of having the story just straight up tell you what happened. You had to actually think. And that was very popular at the time. On top of that, it added a touch of reality to things in the same way that like the Blair Witch Project, for example, added realism to some of the horror movie stuff. So it wasn't just, oh, hey, here's a story about things happening to people. They did the whole found footage thing. So you know it was staged, you know they filmed it, and it wasn't real, but they framed it that way to sort of get you in the mindset of treating it like it was real. And a lot of these authors did the same thing that like the William Beckford did with saying, oh, well, this is the translation of a story that I found in another language, to try to get the reader into that sort of mindset. Oh no, what's going to happen if this is a translation of a story? So it's the same kind of thing. Oh, So this slide, real quick, goes over the setting, plot, and characters in Gothic novels. So really quickly, I want to go through these. I know that you guys know what setting and plot are, and obviously characters by now, but I just want to take a moment to just go over the main points, hit up the main points of these, and you can read them and take your own notes, obviously. So Gothic writers placed great emphasis on the setting, which served the purpose of conjuring terror and dread and creating an atmosphere of mystery and suspense. So I give you a list of the different types of places that were used as settings: sinister castles, ruins, monasteries, cemeteries, labyrinths, and dungeons. And then down here at the bottom, we also have the setting extended beyond just castles, cemeteries, and labyrinths. In a Gothic novel, the landscape itself was haunted and and mysterious. So not just the building itself, but even the land that the building was on. And then it says here in the middle, very often a ruined castle or abbey acted not just as a passive setting where the main action took place, but as an active force in the story. The ruins created an eerie atmosphere and also influenced events in the plot. Um, so basically, it wasn't just that the setting was there and you forgot about it. The authors would write about noises from the atmosphere interrupting characters while they were mid-thought. The walls sounding like they breathe because they're underground, groans and creaks of the floorboards while people were walking, the ways that dead trees whip in the wind. All of those details tried to pull together the scary kind of mood that people were reading at the time. The second one here is plot. So they just talk about the ways that people wrote at the time, and the plots of the stories, what they were. So what's important to remember is that outside of um, Radcliffe, who was the one that argued that terror should be the focus and not horror. Basically, there were a lot of authors that came after her, that came after Anne, and thought, well, yeah, so I could follow those guidelines, or I could just do what I want. So you had a lot of authors that didn't really feel like they had limits. This was like the first time that writers kind of didn't really follow any rules at all. So they didn't always explain how and why things happened in their books the way they did. There were a lot of different plots and subplots. Sometimes the subplots were connected to the main story. Sometimes they weren't. They just were things that happened off to the side to make things extra creepy. But in terms of things that most Gothic novels shared, most of them had foreshadowing. So they would already tell you or describe a place that was either evil, cursed, there was some sort of prophecy, talking about a family who like had members missing or that died of bad luck from accidents and stuff like that. And there were usually a lot of long lost relative sort of things. So this is where that started too. You have a long lost relative that is coming to visit you or something like that. And usually they were villains. Usually they were villains that were taking advantage of the heroine. At the end of these stories, mostly the villains would die and their riches would be left to the main character. So they would just have to go through a lot to earn their riches. Another important thing was unearthing secrets that had been buried in the past. Pretty much just it's exactly what you think. You'd find out something awful about your family. You'd find out something about some awful things that happened in the castle that you didn't know about, like that sort of convention that people use in horror films, not knowing what happened here, came from Gothic literature. And the last thing is characters. So they give you a list of the different types of characters here. So there were only really 3 or 4 types. So the main types were the hero, the heroine, and the main villain. So the heroine represented innocent, curious, and powerless women. So these were kind of carried over from medieval times as well. Usually the woman was just very pure, and they were pretty much running from the villain the whole story until they got rescued. This is where like the damsel in distress came from. There are some other earlier literatures that talked about doing favors for women or doing things in the name of women, but this was where the damsel in distress, like being completely helpless, became very popular. They usually cried, became hysterical, or passed out. So, like women fainting on the couch, that kind of came from here, or at least was popularized by it. The hero was usually noble, intelligent, humorous, and brave, all of the things you expect a hero to be. And basically, he was just there to rescue the heroine. And sometimes you got some background, on him too. Later novels in the Gothic period ended up with stories that were focused on the villain, who was the main attraction to the novel. So in the beginning, they were just someone for the heroes to take down, but over time, they became the focus of the whole novel. So either the novel would be about a villain doing something awful, um, and just continuing to do bad things until they fall into madness and unravel, question their sanity and all that stuff. But sometimes there were villain heroes. So villain heroes were just main characters who were willing to do awful things. So they were never pretty much bothered with morality or having a conscience. They basically just did whatever it is they wanted to do. And they were the main character, so they didn't always die in these sort of stories, but they usually were dark, brooding, and cunning. And over the course of the story, they would kind of go mad or go crazy. Usually they were a tyrant who was rich, carrying over from that rich relative trope. Okay, so the second half of this lesson is mostly about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So I give you a lot of information here about Mary Shelley and her life. And in these lessons, I don't go through the readings because that would take way too much time. But I will overview some of the sections that are important in terms of explaining things about the book. So they tell you about when Frankenstein was written. A summary of it is that she wrote Frankenstein, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein during a period of great upheaval in British history. The Industrial Revolution was quickly changing British society, and like many of her friends, she regarded it with suspicion. I know that it's a little hard to imagine the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Romantic period, and the Gothic period happening so close together, but these were really not that different periods in time. The Industrial Revolution did not happen too long after the end of the medieval period. So that was around 1500. So if she published this book in 1818, that means that the Gothic era started a little more than 200 years after the end of the Middle English period. So in that time, that's like 200 years is still a lot of time, even though these are happening back to back. If you remember from the history of English language lesson from 12A, they talked to you about being worried about how quickly English was changing. And this was part of those changes that was happening at the time. So they give you the rundown on the main characters in Frankenstein, and they explain who everyone is and how things are related, how these people are related. So this is pretty straightforward, so I'm not going to go over it too much. This is also where you start reading volume 1 of Frankenstein. So they go over volume 1. And this is pretty much just information about the themes. They highlight a couple quotes that are important for you to remember. Remember, if you don't understand it while you're reading it, that's okay. They do give you an overview of these lessons just so that you can catch things that you might have missed. And if you're having a hard time, like just struggling to read anything, which I hope you wouldn't, because this is written as something pretty close to modern English, you can still schedule a tutoring session to handle this. And we can go through the reading with you and make sure that you understand it from point to point if the analysis doesn't help you. So they just go on and give you information about how this book is titled. Um, Mary Shelley is basing this story on other Greek stories that were written before it. So they're just explaining the connection here. They talk about how she uses light as a symbol in the novel. It makes a big difference when there is light in a room and isn't. The way that she talks about lighting shows you different things that she's trying to give you information about in the story. Here they talk about the female characters that are in the story. Slide 25. And on slide 27, they go into more information about Frankenstein. That's the doctor's name, and the creature that he made. So again, I'm not going to go over this because obviously this is right before you get to part 2 and we haven't read part 1 yet, but just letting you know this is where it starts. Now, this is actually important regardless of if you've read this or not. So they're talking about the sublime in Frankenstein. So if you remember, sublime is that feeling of terror and awe, that fear that you get, that sort of overwhelming, oh my God feeling that you're supposed to get from reading Gothic literature. So it's supposed to lift the mind to a higher plane. You're supposed to basically feel like you're small and significant to the story. It says here, an example of the sublime is that feeling people experience when they gaze at the stars on a dark night or view dramatic steep mountains. You're just supposed to be moved by the story and the things that are in it. So what they're telling you here is that Gothic writers regarded nature on a reservoir of sublime experiences. So in Frankenstein, there are a lot of scenes, natural scenes especially, that are described in a way that are supposed to make you feel like you were there, looking at the scene and just taking it in. It says here, Shelley uses sublime natural phenomena to show emotions and the subconscious desires and needs experienced by the characters. Now, this is another thing that's relevant to what we talked about, narrative shift. So the important thing here about the narrative shift is that Frankenstein is a framed narrative. So the story is told from the view of the person who's living the story at the time. But even though that's true, there are 3 different narrators in this story. So there's Frankenstein, that's the doctor, and the monster that he made. They both tell the story from their own perspectives. So you're almost getting 2 stories from the both of them from their own points of view. And then on top of that, you have Walton, who shares these stories with his sister. So you technically get 3 different versions of this story. And there's a lot of narrators here since there's a lot of people telling the story. So the goal in pointing this out to you is that everyone has their own feelings about what they experienced and what they heard. So that might affect who's accurately telling the story. You know that or at least you'll learn that the doctor wants to play God by creating the monster. That's what Frankenstein does. By making the monster, he's trying to get closer to becoming God by using science to create a person, basically. So with him being so ambitious, he thinks very highly of himself. And it's possible that at different points in the story, he could be exaggerating something or straight up lying about something because he's convinced himself in his own head, and that's what you're reading, that something is true. The point of the story switching perspectives in Frankenstein is that the goal is for you to read one story, move on to the next, and sort of compare and contrast. You're supposed to rethink everything that you read before and include the new information. Who's supposed to give you more detail or clarity, or at least point out that things happening from different perspectives might not be true. If people die in the book, how did they die? Who actually killed them? If someone ran away or broke something or did something, did they actually do that? Or did someone assume that that's what the other person did? Since you're in the head of the character that's telling the story at the time, you don't really know. So you're supposed to go back and try to think of clues that were in the story that are probably not or couldn't be or would be very hard to make up. And the point of having the narration like this, in Frankenstein especially, is that Shelley's trying to prove nothing is what it seems. It's important to always look deeper and be aware that there's more to things than what you know. So this slide is about the power of language, and they basically just talk about um, language being important for understanding and participating in society. Now, this is important. Just without spoiling anything, you don't really have to read the book to know this, but the monster had to learn how to speak and how to talk to people. Um, the monster basically has to learn about how to be a human, or at least try to be human in society. And he learns the power of language, not just verbal language, but the way that people touch and interact with each other. So that's an important theme of the story as well. Here, they just point out that there are references to John Milton's Paradise Lost. So basically, there's religious references in this book, which makes sense. There's usually religious references in Gothic works because it's a response to the Enlightenment and to the ruins that are left over from religious buildings and stuff. Everything that we just talked about that was left over from the Catholic Church. Okay, so volume 3, there are 3 volumes to Frankenstein. It's just the rest of the story. So again, I'm not going to spend any time on this. You're going to need to read through it to actually understand it fully. And as you can tell, this is a long lesson, mostly because they go over this story in so much detail. It's about half of the lesson. So they go over a lot of the other themes, the differences and similarities between the characters in the story. And then they give you an overview of everything that you've gone over at that time. So when you read the story and you actually go over it, take time to look at this overview, because it'll basically, ask you to take a step back from all the specific information that they gave you about breaking down the quotes and showing you what stuff meant, for you to get like a full package understanding. And again, if you're having difficulty with understanding what the lesson is explaining to you for the reading, you can schedule a session with a tutor. Okay, so this is pretty much the last section before we get around to the end of the lesson, the Gothic legacy. So this is pretty much a summary of everything that we've learned so far outside of just the reading excerpt. So this slide talks about how the Gothic legacy basically continued to influence a lot of other writers. There's a lot of writers that you're going to get to know in this class, but that also you might have read in other classes. Jane Austen, for example, did a parody of Gothic novels. So Gothic novels were so popular that a lot of writers like Jane Austen mocked its style, so made fun of it by writing silly versions of those books. So Northanger Abbey is one of those. And Thomas Love Peacock's Nightmare Abbey is another one of those. If the title has Abbey somewhere in there, or a castle, or an estate, something like that, odds are it's probably Gothic, just because those were the buildings that those books were set in at the time. And then they go on to talk about how Gothic stuff influenced the Victorian era. So even though we just talked about Byron, Keats, and all of them, Byronic heroes were inspired by a lot of the Gothic novel characters. So they kind of combine some of the dark, brooding villain traits from the villains in Gothic stories. And that helped make up part of the Byronic hero. Because if you recall from the last lesson, Byronic heroes are dark and brooding, even though they're very intelligent, that kind of thing. And the Bronte sisters novels, Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, were also inspired by Gothic stuff. Even moving into newer things, C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, both of them were also inspired by not the elements of Gothic horror, but the same things that they were that the Gothic writers were inspired by. So stuff from the medieval times, a lot of the religious imagery, a lot of the older buildings, the sort of fascination with fantasy and putting the supernatural into stuff. So the biggest point to take away here, I'm going to stop sharing, is that a lot of the writing from the Gothic era still survives, and we use them in stories to this day. A lot of the things that we talked about in terms of the settings being foreshadowing, a lot of the different types of characters, and the damsel in distress and stuff, being able to actually be in a character's head while they're telling you the story. All of those things are influenced by Gothic literature. So even though they were a small couple groups of people that held land in England for a short while, they inspired a lot of stuff that affects stories for years, centuries to come. We're in 2021, and horror movies still use a lot of the details that Gothic novels made popular. Alrighty, but that's pretty much it for me. I've said this a couple times during this. This was a long lesson, but if you need more detail or someone to go over Frankenstein with you, please schedule a tutoring session with your tutor. You can talk to your mentor or advocate to get that information, and we can go over the readings with you. It's just hard to sort of put those into these lessons. This is just supposed to be an overview to sort of catch information that you might not understand before you get to the reading. Alrighty, with all of that said, I am Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English class.